But Father, we're just bringing what you've said over and over again. And so, Lord, we just pray this morning, particularly, Lord, that if there's anything that I shouldn't say, that you'd shut my mouth. And Lord, if there's something that I've forgotten to put in here, Lord, that you would bring it to mind. I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. I will let you all know I've only had one coffee this morning and a decaf. So I've learned my lesson from last time. Right, so we have 10 days until Christmas. So I thought it would be good to start with a Christmas quiz. So I'm going to give you a line from a movie, and you need to figure out what movie it's from, okay? I just like to smile. Smiling is my favorite. God bless us, everyone. Every time a bell rings, an angel gets his wings. It's a Wonderful Life. It came without ribbons, it came without tags, it came without packages, boxes or bags. What's the official title? There we go. All right, so this morning we are expecting the unexpected. I will put an expectation out there that when I ran it through, it was quite long. So now, if it's shorter, you'll be happy, right? But you don't know how long was how long. So if it's less than an hour and a half, we're good, okay? Right, in our first week of Unexpected, so Unexpected has been looking at the story of Jesus' birth, right? And Paul Gaskin drew our attention to the good news of great joy that on a personal level means that we who have placed our faith in Jesus could have peace on this earth. That we don't have to allow anything to remove our peace. Then, this past week, Paul Edwards asked the question, are you welcome? And with awesome biblical stories about how God redeems even the schemers, the sinners, and the strangers, we were encouraged and reminded that all of us are welcome. But those weeks just laid out a taste of relationship with God and how it completely changes our experience of the present and our future. And this morning, we're going to do a little trip to the past. See my Christmas carol? So we're going to be looking at Matthew 2, and we're going to see what happened after Jesus was born, why Matthew keeps bringing up prophecies from the Old Testament, and what this means for us, okay? So, Matthew 2, we're going to have to remember that Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience, okay? So it's always really important to take into consideration who you're writing to. When I write to my friends, I write very differently than I write to... I don't really write to many other people. But you get what I'm saying? So you have a different approach to things, and you have a different emphasis. And for Matthew, do you know what this is? Pan of chocolate, right? Matthew is writing, and he's kind of expecting that his readers are going to take a bite of a pan of chocolate, right? They're going to get every layer, and they're going to get the chocolate center. The difficulty is for us, we often take a piece of layer off and go, oh, this looks tasty, right? And then we go to the next layer, and we kind of look at the next layer and go, oh, this tastes tasty. But Matthew is writing to Jewish people, and in that time, they wouldn't have just known the Old Testament. They would have actually memorized whole sections of it. So when Matthew refers to something in the Old Testament, he's not expecting them to go, he's expecting them to take it with the whole context of the Bible, okay? So this is where it's really helpful to have people who know Greek and Hebrew, who've kind of gone before us and done a lot of the legwork. And so people like Tim Mackey or Mike Winger or other commentaries, they're really good at highlighting stuff that we would just miss. And it's not just intellectual stuff, but when they pull things together, you see that actually this is all very relational. And remember, in Matthew 1 that Paul looked at last week, Emmanuel is God with us. That was what he was to be called, right? God with us. And he is always relational because he is always with us. So, in Matthew 2, we're going to see 4 quotes from the Old Testament. And we're going to pause at each one because clearly they mean more than we think. You keep on using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. What movie? Thank you. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising, and we have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was deeply disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So he assembled all the chief priests and the scribes of the people and asked them where the Messiah would be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they told him, "because this is what was written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, because out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly summoned the wise men and asked them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, report back to me so that I too can go and worship him." And after hearing the king, they went on their way, and there it was, the star they had seen at its rising, and it led them until they came and stopped above the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overwhelmed with joy. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and falling to their knees, they worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their own country by another route. So here we have a bit of the nativity that we don't often see in primary schools. I mean, who was a king? Were none of you kings in your primary school play? Oh, guys. I think we had 2 kings in our family. Anyone ever get cast as Herod, king of the Jews? Did you actually? Oh, I'm just going to have to go now, my whole plan. Because, really, nobody wants their child to be cast as King Herod, right? He's a nasty character. And so we want to look at, actually, who is he? Because we don't see him very often, because he does some nasty things, as we'll see in a minute. First of all, Rome is ruling over Israel at this time, right? And so Rome, when they are ruling, they've split Israel into kind of 4 different areas, and then they have these people called tetrarchs who are in charge of them. And somehow Herod, in a weaselly manner, seems to convince Rome to give him the title king, right? So he's not actually Jewish. And it feels a little bit like when England made the title Prince of Wales, that actually it was there to kind of make people feel like they had representation, when actually it was just a means to control and subdue. Okay? So this is who Herod is. And so you can imagine his surprise when this power-hungry puppet king has these astrologers who come from afar, right? So people who are studying the stars and taking meaning from them. And we call them the magi or the kings. And they turn up and they're asking Herod, who's not actually the king, where is this king? So it doesn't go down well. You know, it's like heading to the prime minister and being like, so where's the actual prime minister? Right? It's not going to, and it clearly upsets Herod and all of Jerusalem, which I feel like might be an exaggeration. I'm not sure all of Jerusalem cared that much. But he goes to the leading priests and the religious leaders of that day, so those who know the Old Testament inside and out, and so they would have been Jewish. And he says to them, where is this Messiah supposed to be born? Where is this king supposed to be born? And this is where we get our first quote from the Old Testament. I feel like I'm missing a page here. Here we go. So the quote that we get is from Micah, okay? And so we need to know who Micah is and why is Matthew quoting him. So we're going to do a little backstory here, okay? In the beginning, God creates earth and everything in it, right? We're going all the way back. And the most important for us is that he creates humanity, right? Adam and Eve. And he creates them to be known and to know him, to be with him. They are given an identity, a purpose, security. And then we have a temptation that's posed by an accuser. Did God really say? Is God holding something back from you? Don't you want to be like God, knowing all of the knowledge of good and evil? No, the answer was no, right? The answer was no, I'm good, I'm fine. But that's not what they did, right? Temptation took root, and when Adam and Eve started to question the goodness of God, what grew was sin. The questions produced actions, and that action was disobedience. They ate from the one tree that was out of bounds. They broke the rule. And from that point, you see the beginning of God's rescue plan, right? Right from the beginning, he says that he will deliver his people. Even in the way that he is talking to Satan about what his discipline will be for tempting Adam and Eve, he gives us hope of there will be someone who comes that will crush the head of the serpent. And in the process of doing that, that person will have their heel bruised. And so we see that God is not done with humanity. One of the teens asked me on a Friday, if God knew what Adam and Eve were going to do, why did he create the earth? And I think it's a bit like having a child. Like, you know they're going to poop on you. You know they're going to puke on you. They might even tell you that they hate you, right? But actually, you know that the relationship that you develop with them is worth it. And you definitely don't give up on them the first time that they disobey you. So, if that's us, amplify that up 1,000 times, right? You've got the perfect Father who loves perfectly. God with us. He's not done with humanity. So the whole Old Testament story is of how God makes a way to have a relationship with his people, okay? So time after time, people listen to temptation. It takes root. God's people disobey him. They reject him. And yet he's relentless. He never gives us up. He provides a deliverer to help his people out of the messes they created. And the Bible Project, this is like the Old Testament overview. And you just see this like cycle, right? And it's like a pan of chocolate. Has anybody made a pan of chocolate? Croissant? Have you made one? From scratch? It takes a long time, doesn't it? So you have to take the dough, and then you put butter in it, and then you fold it, and then you chill it, and then you take it out, and then you roll it, and you fold it, and you chill it, and you take it out, and you roll it, and you fold it, and you chill it. And that's exactly what the Old Testament's like. It's the same cycle going over and over and over, where you have people not trusting God, and then they are allowed to make choices, and then they feel the consequences of that. God sends a deliverer, and then the cycle repeats, and then the cycle repeats. And the issue is that God sends these deliverers, he sends kings, he sends people like Gideon or Moses, and then King David. And he sends kings even because the people of Israel are like, well, other countries have kings. We want a king. They had the God of the universe, right? Who had relationship with them. And they had like tangible stuff that they could like see that he was real. There was no like level of kind of doubt that this was a real God. And yet they were like, well, we need a king. And God in his grace gives them one. And that king fails. And the next king fails. And the next one. And Israel finds themselves in this cycle over and over again. And then he sends some people called the prophets. And sometimes the king and the prophets overlap because sometimes the prophets are there to tell the kings that actually they've gone the wrong way. And when we think of a prophet, a lot of times we think about someone who's telling the future, right? But the prophets in the Old Testament are so much more than that. They are people that God has chosen to speak on his behalf. And often, they are warning people of the future, that if you continue in this way, this is what will happen. But much of time, they're reminding Israel of their allegiance to God. They had a covenant. And what we have in like our present time when we talk about covenant is a marriage vow, right? And so essentially the prophets are reminding Israel, you have made a relational contract with God. And then they tell them to stop messing about with other gods because people don't change. Israel was tempted by the other gods because the other gods from other countries, from other people groups, were offering things like power and sex and wealth. And we get tempted by the same stuff, don't we? And the result is the same. They're fake, and they don't bring any level of security, significance, or identity. So God sends another deliverer, but we also need another human. The cycle needs to end. And this is why Matthew is quoting from Micah the prophet, so that now we can see that actually there's a backstory that needs to fill in so we understand the depth of what's going on here in the second chapter of Matthew. So let's go to the chocolate center. This is our first of four prophecies that we see in chapter 2. And this one is pretty straightforward, right? These Jewish leaders that Herod was speaking to were convinced of it too. And what we saw was the first bit here, right? Bethlehem, Ephrathah, you are small among the clans of Judah. One will come from you who will be ruler over Israel. And then if you look, he will stand and shepherd them. So the bit that we see in Matthew is kind of like combined. And he will be their peace. This prophecy is fulfilled in Jesus. At the time of Micah, when he's giving this prophecy, this is unfulfilled, okay? It hasn't been filled. So if we think about it almost like a cup. In Micah, the cup is empty. When Jesus comes, he fulfills this by being born in Bethlehem. But not just being born in Bethlehem, because he fulfills all the other things in that prophetic word as well, okay? So this is how prophecy works in a one-to-one. So Micah's thing hasn't been fulfilled, and then it's fulfilled by Jesus. Does that make sense? So that's the easy ones. And he wants us to see that the very place that Jesus was born was part of the evidence that he was compiling to show that we could be certain that Jesus was indeed God's chosen king. There's stuff going on with Micah and the Israelites at the time, but this is directed about the Messiah, okay? And Herod's, friends are very convinced of that as well. So, let's keep going. Herod's response to this news that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem is that he grabs the Magi and says, all right, so just give me some more information here. How long has it been that the star has been here? And he gleans as much information as possible. And then in a slimy, weaselly way, he tells them to come back and tell him all the information so that he too can worship this king. It reminds me a little bit about like Wormtongue or the White Witch, in the way that you watch those movies and you're like, how do you not see that you're being deceived? And so they're slimy, they're power hungry, and that's all that comes to mind when I think about Herod, is oozing with slime and deceit. And just a side note, if you thought for 1 second that Jesus never had to deal with lying political leaders that were only looking out for themselves, think again. Where was God when political powers were lying in Bethlehem? He was with them. More story. So these magi, these wise men, find Jesus and his parents. And then what do? They give them financial provision for what they needed for the road ahead of them. Did you ever think about that? That gold, frankincense, and myrrh were not like mementos. Did any of you guys get like baby's first this and you put it on the shelf, right? It wasn't like baby's first gold and frankincense and myrrh. This was expensive, right? These were costly items that they were giving to them. And so God was providing for Mary and Joseph. And when we first moved to Merthyr, we had bought our house and we literally put everything into purchasing the house, so we have nothing. And our house had been empty for 17 years, and so there was lots of stuff that needed doing on it, and we just didn't have the money. And yet, we'd have these things turn up, like random, anonymous financial gift, or a housewarming gift from a friend. And initially my mind would be what could we buy for the house? And I'd get really quite excited about the decorative vase that I was going to buy. And then inevitably, a bill would turn up. And no joke, every time, the gift that we had been given was the exact amount that we needed for the bill. And you almost then got to the point where somebody would give you a financial gift. I feel like this is crazy because it doesn't normally happen. People just gave us financial gifts. We were strapped. But we get a financial gift and all of a sudden you go oh, what's going to break? Because God always provided beforehand. And the reality is we had so little, and he was providing even before the need arose. And he was incredibly kind. And yet, depending on which perspective you have in the situation, you could either see it as provision or loss, right? Because in my mind, I was like, there goes my decorative vase. Anyone who knows me knows I don't do vases. A vase. And for Mary and Joseph, they probably had no idea what they were going to do with these valuable gifts, right? We could buy a farm, buy a decorative vase. But God had already provided for the road ahead. And I just want to point something out here, because I'm a stickler for do you notice that it never says there were 3 kings? It was 3 types of gifts. We don't even know if there was 3 bundles of gifts. It could have been that there was 20 kings and all of them gave a different one of those 3 things, right? So we 3 kings, it's just wrong. So what happens next? God gives these wise men, these astrologers, these magi, whatever you want to call them, a dream that instructs them to mark and avoid Herod, right? Don't go back. And you can imagine, if these guys were prepared to set out on what was possibly a 2-year journey to get to where this star was, that actually, if they've got a dream where God tells them to go a different way, I think they're going to listen. And they do, don't they? So exit stage left, the magi. And so then we get to, after they were gone, so that was the king's magi, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream saying, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and stay there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and escaped to Egypt. He stayed there until Herod's death, so that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled. "Out of Egypt I called my son." Has any of you ever looked up these things when you've read this passage? Because I never did. I was just like, oh, that's nice, right? We just read things, don't we? We read them because it's like a pan of chocolate, and we've got this layer, so we just look at the layer. But actually, there's so much more to this. And so when we see things like this, where you've got your footnote, or you're like, that just seems like a weird thing to say, ask the questions. Google it. There is so much stuff that's available just by Googling. And now AI takes it and makes it even easier to find the summary of it. Don't trust AI. So here we've got prophecy number 2, but let's look at the story, okay? So it says that they had to escape because Herod was going to come after them. For you who are parents, old or new, when you have a small child, there are lots of things to worry about. There are lots of unknowns, right? Do you remember those early days? Are they eating enough? Are they pooing enough? Is that a rash? At what point do we start solids? Some of you have had greater concerns. Will they walk? Will they ever talk? Will they survive? The early years of being a parent is filled with unknowns. But can you imagine being confronted with this known? This king who already has a horrendous reputation, he's coming for your child, your helpless child. It must have been terrifying, but it also gives us a window into reality. Jesus experienced terror and hardships too. He and his family fled from Bethlehem to Egypt. And the place in Egypt, there was in Alexandria, there was kind of a Jewish population there. So it's probably a 300-mile journey, right? That's 8 days walking. And that's Google. I don't know what it is. Do you mean, and that's 8 days straight, isn't it? And so this would have been a really long journey, a really expensive journey. But it's really good that somebody gave them mementos beforehand, right? And so God has already provided what they would need. And do you think Mary had a little tear about her decorative vase bubble being popped? I don't think so. But where was God in the midst of the terror? He was right there with them. And then we get this random line. Okay, so the random line, I called my son out of Egypt, right? Where is it from? It's from Hosea. And this is where we start to get our flaky layers and the movie references, right? So Matthew is making the assumption here that you're not just going to look up this tiny bit, but that actually it's going to be like a hyperlink or a movie reference that makes you think of the whole movie, right? So if you think of like every time every time a bell rings, an angel gets his wings, right? You don't just think that line. It then kind of draws back the whole story, doesn't it, to your mind? And so when Matthew uses this tiny bit of Hosea 11, the whole point is that it's meant to draw back to you the whole wider story. So let's go to this. The Lord's love for Israel is the title of it, and I said I wasn't going to read that, and I just did. So when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Who's the son in Hosea 11? Israel, right? So God is talking about Israel like he's a son. So when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called him. Israel called to the Egyptians. Even as Israel was leaving them, they kept sacrificing to Baals and burning offerings to idols. It was I who taught Ephraim, so Ephraim was one of the northern tribes of Israel, to walk and taking them by the hand, but they never knew that I had healed them. So, do you see anything about a chosen king here? No, he's talking about the Israelites, right? And how they were called out of Egypt, and even as they were leaving Egypt, they were betraying God, right? Burning to idols and whatnot. And so this is the second type of prophecy that we see in this passage, and more widely throughout the New Testament as well. We see writers and Jesus himself doing this, where they will refer to something in the Old Testament that is like an unfinished or unresolved story in order to show that it's actually Jesus who fulfills this, right? So this story, did the Israelites follow God perfectly after they left Egypt? No. Did they keep their covenant with God? No. And so in what's being referred to, this has happened. So it's not like a prophecy and like a telling of the future, but it's being used to show that what was unfinished and their cycle of sin wasn't dealt with yet. And so Hosea, we're going to look at it as almost like a half-filled cup, because it did happen. It's not like it's an unfulfilled prophecy. It's not like the prophecy of I'm seeing a story screen where I'm seeing the future. It's something that's showing us more information about what Matthew is trying to convey about who Jesus is. So when he makes this reference, it makes us think of Egypt. It makes us think of the whole story of Egypt leaving. But also when he makes that reference, we see this word son, right? And so I called my son out of Egypt. And so Matthew is quoting Hosea as he's drawing a comparison between Israel, who is his son, and Jesus, who is the son, right? And in fact, Matthew is drawing an even closer comparison with Jesus being the perfect deliverer, better than Moses. And yet, when we look at Jesus' life, we can see that actually Jesus is fulfilling what Israel, God's son, couldn't do. And like Moses, Jesus is bringing a covenant to his people. Do you see this? Journey to Egypt. Escapes a king killing baby boys, right? Moses. Escapes a king killing baby boys, Jesus. God's son, Israel, is called out of Egypt. God's son is called out of Egypt. 40 years in the wilderness, 40 days in the wilderness. I think he would have been 70 if he did this years as well. Passes through the Jordan. Where is Jesus baptized? In the Jordan, right? Bringing a covenant. But unlike the law, which Moses brings down from the mountain to the Israelites, and which they couldn't keep, this new covenant that Jesus was bringing was one where he would do what we can't, and he would pay for what we should have. Hosea is talking about something that has happened but isn't fully resolved. It's unfulfilled. There's loose ends. And this is what Matthew is pointing to here. The whole story of Israel, not just the calling out of Egypt. It's like using this passage, he wants you to think and access the whole Israel movie in your mind. And you go, oh yeah, that's unfinished. It's a loose end. It's unresolved. But in Jesus, he fully fills it, doesn't it? So it's like a full cup, like he fulfills it. He fills it to the top. So let's keep going. Then Herod, when he realized that he had been outwitted by the wise men, flew into a rage. He gave orders to massacre all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, in keeping with the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then what was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be consoled because they are no more. This is horrendous. Can you imagine Mary and Joseph getting word after they'd escaped that actually Herod had killed all those boys? And because of the, historians think that because of the birth rates and the populations, whatever, we're talking about 25 to 50 baby boys. And you won't find this in any other historical places. Matthew is the only place that refers to it. But also, 25 to 50 boys in the wider picture is probably why it's not documented. It was a small place. Bethlehem was a small place. Herod had killed all the baby boys out of his bloodlust for power. Another layer to the same story. A king fearful of his power being removed. And then you have this prophecy from Jeremiah. And so it's from Jeremiah 31. And this is what it says. This is what the Lord says, a voice was heard in Ramah. And then we've read this bit, but I'm going to keep going because from verse 16 we see something. Keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for the reward for your work will come. This is the Lord's declaration, and your children will return from the enemy land. There is hope for your future. This is the Lord's declaration, and your children will return to their own territory. Now this is from the prophet Jeremiah. 600 years before Jesus. He's prophesying about Israel being taken into exile, so being captured. And this happened. So Jeremiah's prophecy was fulfilled. It happened. It was a horrendous moment in Israel's history. And so Babylon surrounded Jerusalem. People were starved out. People were killed. The city was taken. Many people died. And those who survived were taken to this place called Ramah, which is just outside of Jerusalem. And you've got Ramah, Bethlehem, and Jerusalem all located right next to each other. And the survivors were chained and then taken away into exile. And Jeremiah is talking about Rachel as this mother figure for Israel. Because remember, it's Rachel's 12 sons that are the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So I was trying to think, in Welsh culture, who would be a matriarch? Who? Boadicea. Yes. I feel like it'd be like a law being passed and us saying, Boadicea is crying from her grave, right? Giving up freedoms. Boadicea is crying from her grave, or territories. And so this is kind of the imagery that Jeremiah is using, is saying Rachel. So he's not saying she's actually crying from her grave. He's saying what is taking place here rocks the roots of our very nation, right? And so what's important is that Jeremiah's warning came to pass, right? So he said this before this happened, and it came to pass. And Israel experienced the consequences of their choice to reject God and his good boundaries he'd set for them, right? God didn't take away that consequence because they made that choice. So this prophecy is filled, but it's not fully filled. In that, did you see the bit about the hope for your future? It's a dangling story. It's like an end of part one to a two-parter. Remember when we returned from our flashback back to Jesus' childhood, they're still, they are back in their territory, but they're still being ruled over, aren't they? They're not free. And so what is that hope for your future? Who is that hope? And Jesus is going to make the right choices where Israel went wrong, which led to their captivity. And Jesus will bring fulfillment to the hope that Jeremiah is prophesying about. So that's where we get our full cup. So he will fully fill this. But don't miss something here. Jeremiah and Matthew are using the same passage to convey something. Where is God in the midst of all this evil? If Rachel would weep as this matriarch, then what is it conveying about the father's heart? He's weeping. He's grieving over the state of his children. Where is God when we walk through horrendous things? When we're hurt? When we feel like everything is falling apart? Where is he? He's Emmanuel. He's God with us. He is grieving with us. But also, in our unfinished stories, there is hope. Jesus comes to address the human condition. Where is God? Where is God in the midst of the human tragedy? And with what these stories that we're reading in Matthew is trying to get us to see that God revealed in Jesus, he is Emmanuel. But he's not here to make our wildest dreams come true. In fact, you and I live in a world where God so honors the dignity and the moral decisions of image-bearing human beings that he has allowed us to create hell on earth. And it's not because God is bad, it's because we are bad. That's the point of the biblical story. So where is God in the midst of this mess we've created? God has actually become subject to the same terrors and tragedies that we experience. Do you see that? That actually God allows us to create mess. Because like we said before, you can't love someone and control someone. It's not compatible. God gives us the right to make our own decisions. And sometimes those decisions have terrible consequences. And sometimes the decisions that other people make have terrible consequences for us. And God won't take over that person like a robot and make that person choose differently, but he will be with us in the midst of the chaos that ensues. And when we ask him to be king of our lives, he can take terrible consequences of our decisions or other people's decisions, and he can use them for our good and his glory. So let's keep going. After Herod died, the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, because those who intended to kill the child are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and entered the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the region of Galilee. Then he went and settled in a town called Nazareth, to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. Okay, so they make their way back to Israel, and they hear that Herod's son is now in control, and he doesn't fall far from the tree. So they head back to Mary's hometown after being warned in a dream. Again, you would start to be wary about going to sleep, wouldn't you? We're compared to a power-hungry, unstable king who wants to kill your child. The wagging tongues and dirty looks of small-town Israel sound manageable, don't they? So they're back in Nazareth, and we have our fourth mention of prophecy. And so where do we find the prophecy that Jesus will be a Nazarene? Nowhere. So what is Matthew playing at? He doesn't say prophet. He says prophets, right? So it gives the impression that there is something that multiple prophets have referred to about the Messiah that Jesus is fulfilling. And this is where I'm very thankful for Tim Mackey and his ability to speak both Hebrew and Greek, because I only speak English and Spanish. And as English readers, we totally miss out on what Matthew is doing here. And I really, really love when we get to grips with what is actually happening in the original language, because it just makes the word pop, right? There's so many things that when you study the word through the eyes of the original language, that you're just like, that is so cool. So, Nazareth means essentially stick town, right? Nasser means stick or branch in Greek. And the same kind of wordplay applies in the Hebrew. The same word for stick and branch is also used in the title of the Hebrew word for Nazareth. So basically, Matthew is pointing out a prophecy, but he's also really enjoying the wordplay here. Almost like a dad joke, but poignant, okay? So Nazareth means stick town, and the Messiah will be a Nazarene, right? So he will be like stick man. So do the prophets have anything to say about a stick or a branch that is tied to Messiah? I'm going to go fast here. How long have I been speaking? Anyone? So Isaiah says, then a shoot will grow from the stump of Jesse. A branch from his roots will bear fruit. And it goes on to talk about how awesome this king is going to be, right? And he will judge the poor righteously and execute justice for the oppressed of the land, right? And then you jump to Jeremiah. Look, the days are coming, and this is what the Lord's declaration, I will raise up a righteous branch for David, and he will reign wisely as king and administer justice and righteousness in the land. Zechariah, here is a man whose name is Branch, right? He will branch out from his place and build the Lord's temple. So even here we've got this prophetic word about the fact that actually Jesus is going to build a temple, and guess what? You're it. And then Isaiah goes on again and says in chapter 53, for he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. And so Isaiah 11 is the one using this naser, Greek word. I almost had it like recorded so I could just play it for you, right? And then all these other references of branches and this idea of something growing, something that's coming off and that will produce a new fruit. And in Isaiah 53, it goes on to say this, but it was the Lord's good plan to crush him. And so this is talking about this Messiah and cause him grief. And when his life is made an offering for sin, he will have many descendants. He will enjoy a long life, and the Lord's good plan will prosper in his hands. When he sees all that is accomplished by his anguish, he will be satisfied. And because of his experience, my righteous servant will make it possible for many to be counted righteous, for he will bear all their sins. I will give him the honors of a victorious soldier because he has exposed himself to death. He was counted among the rebels, right? One of us. He bore the sins of many and intercedes for the rebels. This prophet, speaking on behalf of God to his people, is talking about Jesus. And so when the prophets were giving these prophecies about this Messiah that would come, that would be this branch, it was unfulfilled. But in Jesus, it's fully filled. And I just realized I have no full cut picture. Jesus is not only a shoot, a branch that has come from the stump of Israel, this nation that had been cut down, but he's from Nazareth. He's a stick man from Sticktown. And yet this branch, from this branch, so much more than the nation of Israel will be restored. The chosen King of God, born into gossip-laden circumstances, announced by nobody shepherds, from a line of sketchy characters, thrown into terrible, horrendous circumstances, is Emmanuel. He's God with us. He is acutely aware of the mess that we live in. And this Emmanuel enters into our reality to tie up all the loose ends, to go right where others went wrong, where we went wrong. He is redeeming everything. At the cross, this stick man dies on a tree. He takes with him the punishment that we deserve, deals with everything that separates us from God, everything that separates us from relationship with him. And he rises to life so that we might have life to the full. So maybe it's time to rewrite our dreams and aspirations to be that which no human evil can thwart. In Revelation, there's another prophecy, and this one is unfulfilled, so it's yet to happen, right? Behold, the tabernacle of God is among the people. and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. So there we have something that's been fulfilled, right? And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning. There will no longer be any power-hungry kings that make decisions that end the lives of many people, or crying, or pain. The first things have passed away. And he who sits on the throne said, "Behold, I am making all things new." We have tastes of that now, right? And he's making us new. So here's what I want you to take away this morning. That in the midst of your chaos, he's with you. In the midst of your terror, he's with you. In the midst of your disappointment, he's with you. He is a God who brings peace, a God who welcomes in, and he's a God who has placed himself in our mess so that we might have relationship with him. He is God with us. And maybe we need to change the expectations that we have. It's really important that we approach life with truth as our lens. And we talk all the time about the importance of knowing truth, because if the lens that we approach life with is one of our expectations, then we can often find that we have a wrong understanding of who God is and what he's like and what our relationship with him looks like. And that can affect the way that we experience life. When things don't go as planned, we think God is distant, or he doesn't love us, or even worse, that he enjoys watching us suffer, which is all incorrect. But when my expectations are rocked, I'm rocked. And so if we have decided, or worse, if we've been told by others that following Jesus means that everything will go right for us, or that God is there to make all your dreams come true, we'll be rocked when bad things happen. And this is probably another reason that Matthew includes this little snippet that all the other gospels don't, do they? Do they? I don't think they do. He's with us, and he's experienced it. He doesn't promise smooth sailing or big houses or perfect health in this life. What he promises is to be with us. And in his incredible kindness, he's putting off the day when he returns so that as many rebels can receive the righteousness, the rightness of God, of Jesus. But he also promises that he will return. And when he does, all evil will be removed. All things will be made new. And this promise is for those who have placed their allegiance in Jesus, who accept that covenant relationship. When I married Paul, all his wealth became mine. His family became my family. I had access to an intimacy with him that isn't for anyone else but those who signed that marriage contract. It was just me. But the covenant that Jesus holds out is for all who believe that he was both the deliverer and the new human, who made all the right choices for us and took on all the punishment that we should have had. And it doesn't end there, because by his Spirit, he is making us new. We are seeing the taste of that prophecy in Revelation. And he is making us a new humanity. So challenge number 2 is this: your life goals. We talk a lot about the course that we do here called Freedom in Christ. And one of the weeks of Freedom in Christ focuses essentially on what your life goals are. And basically it says that if you have set a life goal for yourself that requires anyone else to get on board, then you are going to find yourself disappointed, or even worse, maybe bitter with God because you blame him for that. So if my life goal is to have a clean house, I have 5 people that can mess that up. Do you notice how I put myself in there? Where's Caleb? See? If my life goal is to be married, that requires someone else to be on board. If my life goal is to have the perfect children, the perfect spouse, the perfect job, do you get where I'm going here? It requires other people, and I then feel helpless, and there's nothing I can do about that. But God invites us into a relationship with him. And what if your life goal is to be known and to be loved by God and to grow in an understanding of who he is, especially like his withness, and to look more like him? Can any circumstance stop you from meeting that life goal? We've got testimony after testimony in the New Testament of people whose life goal was to be transformed to look like Jesus, and they encountered the worst of human evil, but it didn't stop them fulfilling their goal. Can death stop this life goal? God is with you, church. And sometimes we need to change our perspective to see where God has provided before we even knew we needed it. Ask God to reveal more of what he's like and to give you a new perspective in the midst of walking through a world that is very much in the process of a redemption story. So we're going to take communion now. And when we take communion, again, this is a picture of something that reminds us that actually it's just like Matthew reminded us, that Jesus is the fulfillment of the story of Israel. And so the picture that we get here is from the Old Testament, when the Israelites, the Jewish people, were reminding themselves of God's faithfulness when they walked through terrible circumstances in Egypt, and God got them out. And not only did he get them out, but he spared their firstborn sons. And so then Jesus takes this picture and he reminds us that actually because he did not spare his firstborn son, that we get to experience life and relationship and fullness and peace that nobody can take away. So, do you want to do the bread bit? And band, if you want to come up.